all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie, and today's Throwback Thursday episode of Booksmart is the perfect mix of memoir and writing manual. It's Stephen King's On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft. I consider myself a vintage Stephen King fan. Other than 11/22/63, I have not read any of his recent stuff. Before 11/22/63, The Dark Half was the last book I read of his. I have watched The Green Mile, Dreamcatcher, Under the Dome, and The Outsider, though. On Writing makes me feel old. It's already 23 years old, even though it's much newer than The Dark Half. I didn't pick this book up on my own. It was actually the textbook we used for advanced composition, a class I taught at a community college. First off, I don't know why we don't use more books like these as textbooks. They are much more interesting, accessible, and readable. That would require teachers to do more of the legwork in regard to curriculum and lessons, but I'm very anti-textbook. In any case, On Writing is divided into two sections. The first part is his memoir, with the obvious theme, his writing. The second part is a how-to manual for writing, which obviously isn't all that exciting to read, but still incredibly informative. So let's start with the memoir part. I love finding out background information on how books came to be, the inspiration for movies, even how television shows are developed. So King's memoir about his writing was right up my alley. He begins by comparing his memories to Mary Carr's The Liars Club. If you haven't read it, you should, although it's tedious. She remembers every single detail and tells us every single detail. So you really get bogged down in those details. King's memoir is nothing like The Liars Club, which he tells us right away. His memories are more like snapshots. He barely has what I would qualify as chapters, since some are just paragraph long, or 2 or 3. His format makes for easy reading. At just about 100 pages, it's easily read in one sitting. King relays his story chronologically. He was a sickly child, so spent much of his time in bed reading. He loved horror stories and horror movies, obviously, and he and his older brother created a newspaper. It's interesting to see the telltale signs of a writer and his creativity before he even enters high school. Then he goes to college, gets married, has 2 kids, and writes and works his butt off. He does credit his wife for doing all that she did in terms of raising the kids and such so he could write. And then he writes Carrie. First off, we can thank his wife for saving it from the trash. He melded together 2 girls he knew in high school to create Carrie White. But the idea of the telekinesis came from a time when he was a janitor and cleaned the girls' bathroom, which had a tampon dispenser in it. He had also recently read an article that suggested adolescent girls, when they first get their period, might have supernatural powers. And that's how Carrie came to be. Where would pop culture be without dirty pillows and this? Not to mention the pig's blood, prom, and the whole fire thing. Carrie was actually the 4th novel King had written, but it was Carrie that was published first, which made King rich in 1974. After that, the memoir quickly ends. His mom dies, he's an alcoholic, he can't remember writing Cujo. The Shining deals with his alcoholism, although he doesn't consciously accept that. Misery deals with being tortured by a psychotic nurse, which is what his addiction felt like, and the Tommyknockers he wrote while he was using cocaine. His wife had an intervention for him, and poof, all is well, I guess. His final chapter in his memoir deals with his desk, how he thought he needed this huge desk to be a writer. So he ends it, at least the first chunk of his memoir, with this. Put your desk in the corner, and every time you sit down there to write, remind yourself why it isn't in the middle of the room. Life isn't a support system for art. It's the other way around. What I loved about his memoir part. A fast read gave you tidbits on his earlier writing and how King got his start in writing. It's funny, direct, crass, and to the point. What I didn't like about it, it ends too quickly. So many of his iconic books he never even mentions. What about it? Stand By Me. He named it The Body. The Shawshank Redemption had started to become a staple on TNT by the time King was writing his memoir. Tell us about that. Pet Sematary, which the newer copies has a really cool intro that will tell you more about how that book came to be, but he doesn't mention it here. He doesn't write about why he created stories under the name Richard Bachman, so this is not complete by any means. That part left me a little bit disappointed. At the end of the book, his memoir continues. He had written half of On Writing and set it aside in a drawer. Other than The Stand, On Writing was the only book he set aside incomplete. He's out for a walk one wintry morning and he gets hit by a reckless driver. He almost dies. He loops his writing back to his accident and ends on a very inspirational note, which a near-death experience will likely do to you. Between his memoir and his how-to manual, he has this interlude about what writing is. I still assign this part to my high school English students. It's ultimately about telepathy. Let me read you a part. He's talking about a rabbit. Look, here's a table covered with a red cloth. On it is the cage the size of a small fish aquarium. In the cage is a white rabbit with a pink nose and pink rimmed eyes. In its front paws is a carrot stub upon which it is contentedly munching. On its back, clearly marked in blue ink, is the numeral 8. Do we see the same thing? And then he goes on to describe a little bit about, you might see it this way, you might see it that way. And then he says, I didn't tell you. You didn't ask me for those details. I never opened my mouth and you never opened yours. We're not even in the same year together, let alone the same room, except we are together. We're close. We're having a meeting of the minds. And so he's essentially saying, hey, this 8 on the back of the rabbit is what's key. And we're both seeing it, even if your rabbit looks a little bit different than mine, if your cage looks a little bit different from mine, but we're together, even though we're far apart. And this, to me, is my favorite part of the book. It does more than any textbook can on how to write. Then he goes on to his toolbox part, followed by the writing part, which is all the writing manual stuff. I don't agree with all his information, especially when I'm thinking like a teacher, but there's a lot of good stuff here, like get rid of unnecessary words, use active instead of passive structure, read a lot if you want to write. King made me think differently about paragraphs. He calls the paragraph the basic unit of writing, not the sentence. He talks about closed door and open door drafts, which is a better visual for students than rough and final drafts. And he says fear is at the root of most bad writing. I did not agree with his distaste for consulting a thesaurus. Sometimes the only way students will expand their vocabulary is by using a thesaurus. I still use it when I've noticed I've used the word banish 3 times within a small amount of space. Sure, I'm not going to use houseless or displaced instead, but seeing the 24 words that show up on the thesaurus will allow me to step outside the word and reconstruct my sentence so that I describe how the outcast may feel. And I have to show you this. Our teachers gave us these in American Studies class that I took as a junior in high school. I love vocabulary books. Thanks to this book that I have all still filled out, adventitiously and ennui became my new favorite words when I was 16. My best friend and I use them all the time in everyday conversation and in our notes. Writing is subjective, so his opinions on what is good or bad doesn't necessarily mean the book is inherently good or bad. He does list Flowers in the Attic as bad prose, which made me giggle. But King obviously has the credentials to declare such books as good and bad, and he even admits that The Tommyknockers was an awful book. King also adds in revised and edited portions of work in his memoir manual part so you can see the process. He also references a lot of his novels in this half, providing a few more tidbits to how his iconic works came to be. Even if you don't write or have no interest in writing, if you are a reader, you should be thinking about how these stories came into existence. Analyze the storytelling. Where does it fall apart, or why is it the kind of story you cannot stop reading? Where did the characters come from? How were they created? Why are they doing what they're doing? And remember, it's the readers that usually find the symbolism and come away with the theme. Writers can't force such things on their readers. Do you think about the books after you have read them and not just, I like this book because, or I didn't like this book because? What does it leave you with, and what did you learn from it? What did you gain from the reading experience? Sometimes it's easier to answer those questions, to think about more critically, when you can appreciate the art, the craft, as King calls it, that went into those stories you adore or despise. Let me leave you with this final thought of King's in regard to reading and writing. You do well to remember that we are also talking about magic. That's it for today's episode. Remember, at Booksmart, my goal is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.